There are franchises that feel carefully planned from the start. And then there's The Fast and the Furious, a series that somehow grew from a street racing movie in 2001 into one of the biggest global franchises of the 21st century. And that's exactly why today's conversation is so much fun. Joining me today is Dan Hassler Forrest, whose new book, Fast and Furious Franchising, argues that beneath all the nitrous and the chaos, this series actually tells us something important about Hollywood, about audiences, and about how modern blockbusters are made. We're talking about how this franchise evolved, why it works, and what it reveals about the world that created it. And yeah, we're talking about family. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. You know, maybe the hardest part of getting set for this particular podcast was not working the word family into all of my social media in the preceding days, looking around. It's like, Dan, I'm so excited to talk to you about this franchise, about this book you just wrote, because, oh my gosh, all these thoughts I've been having, you just tore. Oh my gosh, it was amazing.
Are you a fan of the Fast and the Furious yourself?
I am actually a tremendous fan, actually, for a lot of the reasons that you point out. I think this franchise has a lot to say. Not only it changes, right? It changes over time. This franchise, like its initial things to what it has to say, but then also the way that it's reflecting. And that's maybe the big point here, how audiences in studios are kind of reflecting what they think the people want to see and all this kind of, and you can trace this, right? So you can actually use this franchise to study both Americans and, as you point out, global audiences, especially Chinese audiences. And there's a lot of, I'm a historian, man. There's like, I can absolutely ruin any franchise just by talking about it. So I'm excited to ruin this franchise with you.
Let's do it together, man.
Yeah. And if anyone else is still listening, this is going to be great. Do you want to, before we jump in, do you want to introduce yourself and the work that you do? Because you're doing some really cool stuff, man.
Thank you. I've committed myself to doing only things that I enjoy. It's like to the extent of my abilities. So I work. I'm an academic. I'm a media scholar. I work at Utrecht University, which is in the Netherlands. I've lived here most of my life. My parents moved here when I was a kid. I was born in New York. I still I have a lot of family in the United States, and I visit not as often as I'd like to, but about once a year. And I tried out a bunch of different things after graduating college in my 20s, and ended up deciding that the only thing that I really want to do is talk and write about movies, and in a way that I like. I worked in film journalism for a while, and I found that it was too, I'm going to sound super pretentious, but like it was too superficial and too marketing oriented. It was like I was writing consumer reviews, in writing rather than engaging with film. So I thought, well, the people who theoretically would be interested in listening to me talk about movies in the way that I like to talk about them, besides like my three best movie friends, are going to be students, going to be people who are film students. So that's what I decided to do. I wrote my PhD on superhero movies after 9/11 because it seemed to me like they reflected, a change in the way that American culture was addressing, questions of identity and politics through pop culture. And that way of thinking about pop culture is not just something that we consume and that doesn't offer really escapism in the way that we think of it, but that offers us a way to kind of negotiate dominant ideas and position ourselves in a way that is enjoyable. That's what I've been doing ever since. So I like to write about stuff like science fiction and fantasy and horror, like really popular stuff. And for this book, I originally pitched a book that was much broader in its focus. It was more like, I want to write about how like the big changes in franchising in the 21st century, and how fandom and transnational production and blah blah, like a lot of like big abstract things. And the editors of the book series said that sounds great, but the series that we edit really has as its main idea that every book has a specific franchise. So I thought, okay, what's going to be a franchise that captures all of those things? And I went through all of them, and like the one that kept coming up over and over was, weirdly, it wasn't even science fiction. Although I guess Fast and Furious has become more science fiction-y over the years. But it was not Marvel, and it wasn't Star Wars, and it wasn't Star Trek. It was really the Fast and the Furious. So that became the pitch, and it was almost like a dare. It was like, I dare you guys to publish a book in your series about this idiotic franchise, because I am a fan, but I'm also like very aware when I talk to other people. That is, Jason, like, where if you're before, you can't just launch into like, don't you love Fast Five? You have to be like, do you know those movies? Those weird movies about fast cars and hot chicks and and the tiny the tiny shorts and everything, and Vin Diesel being silly. And some people are really into it and they get it, and a lot of people like, I know the movies exist and I have an idea of them, but I've never seen a single one.
So as I read your book, I am so thankful that you did not go down the Marvel or Star Wars route. And look, you and I are both about the same age. Like, there's all kinds of Star Wars stuff back behind me and everywhere
Yeah.
else. I grew up on this stuff, and my poor girlfriend is getting a crash course in my man crush on Obi-Wan Kenobi, and all of these different things. Right, this poor woman. But I feel like this franchise has so much to say. And the cool thing was, as I was reading the book, you go, okay, to the outside person might go, oh, what does what does this franchise really have to say? And like, you get into it and you just keep going. And I felt like as I was reading the book, you kept going deeper and deeper. I was like, holy shit, this keeps going. And this is all of
Mm.
the things that you have to say about this franchise. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this. But there's an interesting thing here, because you talk about this early on in the book. You were not an early convert
No, no, no,
to
no.
this franchise. You
No.
really hesitated for a while.
I was like, so the first movie comes out in the summer of 2001, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and like, for listeners who were like middle-aged guys like us who were around at that time. So it's the summer, it's the year that the first Harry Potter movie and the first Lord of the Rings movie, both came out. It's 2 years after The Matrix and The Phantom Menace, right? So in terms
Mm.
of like big movie franchises, so that's where we are. It's 7 years before Iron Man launches the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I was one of those people who would see like the trailer come up and groan. It's like, oh god, this dumb movie about like the trailer is all like two guys, a cop and a charismatic like thief, and they're kind of into each other. And it was like, oh god, it's like Point Break with
We've seen this
cars, right?
before,
We've
right?
seen
Totally.
this 100 times, and it becomes this big hit, and no critics took it seriously. But it was like it was the biggest movie of the summer, like certainly in terms of how much it cost, because like a mid-budget summer blockbuster. Wasn't based on any kind of existing IP. It was based on like a nonfiction article about illegal street racing in Los Angeles and the the multicultural teenagers who were into that stuff. And like Top Gun, it started off as something that was going to be a little gritty, like almost verite type movie, and it sort of mutated into this big Hollywood thing. And like as those movies kept coming out, every couple of years you'd see another trailer, and every time I just roll my eyes and go like, not another one, are you kidding me? So it wasn't until I think the fifth movie when I read an article by a film critic that was sort of a challenge. It was like, so you think these are dumb movies, but actually they've
Mm.
kind of been intertwining them into this really kind of wacky saga, that's almost like like an epic, and so I was like, oh well, in that case, I'm going to check this out. So I think I bought like a DVD, 5 movie, like they keep re-releasing them on DVD,
Mm.
so they're really cheap to get like the whole saga up to that point on DVD. Just spend a weekend watching them, and you get this thing where you're just like, it's a little bit like these I don't know, these like not quite AAA sagas, movie sagas like Resident Evil or something, or Twilight, where you just sort of you start watching them, and at first you're just kind of like rolling your eyes, but as you watch, you kind of get into it. And you're like, this is kind of fun, And as the story becomes more complicated and more baroque and more like like totally lunatic in the way it's trying to weave all of these things into one relatively coherent ongoing soap opera, even though it was never meant to be that, right? This is like one of the things that fascinates me most, and it's sort of winking at the audience, saying, "Of course, we never planned for like the comic relief in the obviously mercenary sequel, Too Fast, Too Furious, to become like one of the main guys in an ongoing movie saga. But of course, that's what we're doing. And the guy who died in the third movie, we'll just bring him back and pretend the third movie is set in some undefined future. Why not?" And so then and from that moment, I was honestly ride or die Fast and Furious. Like every new movie, I was looking forward to it. And by that time, it became like this almost Mission Impossible type, extravaganza. So they were really hard to miss. And then you're one of the people saying, all your friends are just going like, "Are you serious?" Like, no, these movies are good. And you're actually having conversations trying to get people to watch them with a lot of caveats, etc. But yeah. So that anyway, that's how I got into it.
Yeah, I mean, I find this is such a fascinating study because unlike, say, Star Wars or Star Trek or maybe even Lord of the Rings, where, obviously Lucas planned the first film with Star Wars, and then if it was successful, he had other ideas, right?
Yeah.
I don't get the sense, Dan, that anyone expected this to be anything than a standalone film that would do a little money at the box office back in the summer of 2001, and then they're moving on to bigger and better things. And in fact,
100%.
Vin Diesel does move on to what he perceives to be bigger and better things.
He didn't think there was a future in this stuff. He just thought he did this movie. It was a big hit, and it would open him up to doing. He wanted to do the Riddick movies. He thought they were going to be huge.
Pitch Black.
So he committed to that. He was going to do. He did Triple X. He was like, I get to headline like the new extreme sports James Bond franchise, right?
So bad.
Those were his agent was telling him, don't do another car movie. They're just going to be horrible, And they had this. The screenplay for the second movie, Too Fast, Too Furious, was so awful that so you get it. And but to me it was like all of that is like this very sort of strange and completely unplanned, unpredictable set of circumstances that ultimately yielded, the $6 billion movie franchise. But at the same time, I think, and this is kind of the reason why I besides being an uncloseted fan of the movies, it also, I think it illustrates something that is really essential about it, the change that was beginning to happen in those years, where the first movie really was very typical for how the movie business in the early 21st century was about trying to come up with, like, producers and screenwriters just trying to come up with an idea that was going to be a big movie for that year. It was going to make the studio a lot of money, and if they were lucky, they could ride it for like one or maybe two sequels. That's like the blockbuster logic that had dominated Hollywood from, the late 1970s, early 1980s, increasingly on, and definitely throughout the 90s. That was the idea. You make a movie like Armageddon. It's big and everybody goes to see it, and it's a huge wide release. And in some cases you get a sequel, but a sequel also kind of diminishes the value of the original property, right? So you don't get an ET2, you don't get a lot of movies because it feels like, there's something cheesy and cheap and mercenary about it. But but in the early 2000s, you start getting this starts to change. DVD becomes becomes a way to access movies cheaply and conveniently, and DVD sales become a massive second stream of income for these studios. And so the idea that you could actually build a franchise where the movie where it doesn't diminish over time. It doesn't drop off from Superman 1 down to 2, 3, 4, and then and then it ends. But you can actually build it out. And the Lord of the Rings is the first and best example of you can tell a story in 3 chapters. You can release them over these 3 years. And the reason they're able to do that is because home video releases are going to make the movie accessible after it's out of theaters. So people who didn't bother to see the first one in the theater, they get 2 more opportunities with big releases on home video that are
Mhm.
massively marketed and that are affordably, like they're everywhere. They're at Walmart's, they're at checkout lanes. Everybody gets an opportunity to see them. And then they get another big push just before the new movie comes out. So everybody's on board. So you're growing your audience rather than sort of trimming it down over time, right? So we get into this new age of media access rather than like studios worrying like how are they going to know who Frodo is, right, a year after the first movie came out, because that was always the concern. And so after the third Fast and Furious movie, like the pitch becomes let's like get everybody, all the popular characters from the first three, that are 3 movies that have nothing to like, have very little to do with each other. They're just all 3 of them are like formulaic movies. Every new movie cost more than the one that came before, and it made a little bit less money. So like at one point those lines start converging, and then you're out. Then it's over, right? Then you're like in the direct to video business or something like that. But then Justin Lin who directed the third movie, has this idea, is like, I'm a Star Wars fan and we can make this thing into like Star Wars with cars. We can make like a
Mm.
family-based saga. We'll get Vin Diesel back on board. And then all of the marketing about the fourth film, confusingly titled Fast and Furious, is like, we're bringing them back. We have like, it's a new car. It's old classic parts, but it's a new model, right? And we're putting everything, we're like laying everything out for people who have seen over the past 6 years. They've seen like the original 3 movies, or some of them anyway, and making a new chapter in what's going to be an ongoing saga. And from that moment on, and they're ahead of Marvel and the Disney age Star Wars by several years at that point, saying that's the future. That's going to be the future of movies. It's going to be IP based franchising that is serialized, and that is like every couple of years you get another big blockbuster, and it's every new one's got to be bigger than the previous one.
Yeah, there's so much to break down in terms of the franchise itself. You're absolutely right. The first 2 sequels don't even feel like sequels so much as spin-offs in so many
Yeah,
different
yeah,
ways.
yeah,
Before we get back to that fourth film, which I feel like we really have to talk about Fast and Furious. There are several keystone. There are so many movies inside this franchise now that there are keystone movies that
yeah,
we have to
yeah.
talk about. Their specific importance to the franchise. But I want to break down maybe initially the roots of this very first film, because if they don't nail this film it was never this idea of world building initially, but we have to look at this first film as setting the pieces for this world. And
Hmm.
I'm kind of wondering, Dan, when we look at this very first film, obviously we talk about the Point Break references and things like that. You actually say there's a danger a little bit in making too much of a reference to Point Break, saying, "Oh, this is just a clone of this film,"
Yeah, yeah.
and things like. Why is that?
Well, because I'd say that, like, it's easy to point out how similar it is in the details of the plot, in the sense that
Sure.
it's about a rogue cop who doesn't play by the rules, and in Point Break it's Keanu Reeves, right? He infiltrates a gang that's actually like a cool gang. They're like,
Good
with a
guys.
very with a yeah. Um, and they do the same. So they just transplant this from the surfer bro dude environment of Point Break onto people who boost CD players and do illegal street racing in Los Angeles at night. So it's small, like like petty crime, I guess. Uh, and the bromance going on between, like, the cop and the guy he's after. Um, and so in it's a very obvious similarity. But when Point Break came out, everybody said, like, oh, it's just Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, right? It's, you got
Mm.
the cool charismatic guy, and you got like the young up and coming, he's like, it was kind of smitten by the older, more experienced guy.
Mm.
It's a very, I'd say it's not so much that it's plagiarizing a specific film. It's just that Point Break was already working with well-established archetypes from pop culture, and it was using them very effectively in an appealing summer action movie that had as its unique selling point, like the charisma of the actors and the specificity of the kinds of stunts they were doing. And so in Point Break, it's like very spectacular scenes of skydiving and surfing. And in The Fast and the Furious, it's very spectacular scenes of nighttime racing, cars flipping over, and boosted by the new technology of CGI, which is being used to like dramatize excitingly the internal combustion engine of these cars, right? So they were both like, they're both being sold as ride movies, literally, right? They're movies that you go to see because not because they've come up with this amazing new plot or even basic situation. It's a very familiar situation with very familiar types of characters. They're being played by very charismatic actors. And then the thing that it brings to the table is like, but these guys are going to surf, right? Or, but these guys are going to drive. And so you have a specific subculture, and it has enough to stand out and to be its own thing, while at the same time allowing us as an audience to just, oh, it's this story, right? I can relax. All of the beats, right? There's going to be a love interest, and there's going to be, and they're all going to be, there's going to be various characters that a lot of different people in the audience can, individually react to or relate to in different ways. So you have a semi-diverse environment to cast the net widely, and that's what Hollywood blockbusters were really good at having these ride movies that invite you in, that shake you up a little bit, that don't surprise you narratively, but that give you thrills that are memorable and that are done with the technical proficiency. And both of those movies do that really well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I feel like this is not necessarily like Point Break didn't set the stage for two guys who were unalike but get thrust together to find out they're actually more alike than they think. It's like I'm thinking Butch Cassidy here, and it's all of a sudden, right?
You can go all the way back to like early 20th century westerns. It's just there. Yeah,
it's comforting because it's familiar, right? We've all in our lives walked into relationships and met a new friend who we didn't know how we felt about them initially, that turned out to be this person that becomes family. Yeah. Here we go. Becomes family to us, right?
Yeah.
Dan, one of the things I really, really dug about the book itself is how you do these vignettes and you really dig deep into the specific characters that we see throughout the franchise and talking about them and their importance and what they represent. I think this is a real brilliant part of it. It's these vignettes are really cool. And I don't want to give away the entirety of the book. I want people to read the book. I've read the entirety of the book. It's fantastic. But I do want to talk about this relationship between Dom and Brian and what specifically they represent. Because, you talk about, the ethnic ambiguity of Dom. Yeah. Brian is our stand-in here. Can you talk a little bit about who these two guys are and more important, like why they're written in such a way to appeal to audiences and to hit certain checkpoints?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. How much time you got?
As much as you want. I don't want to go to the office today.
No. But first of all, thanks so much for these. I mean, it's so wonderful to talk to somebody who's even read the book, let alone somebody so enthusiastic and about it. So thank you so much for those kind words. Just to bracket like the contents of the question, like I did include. I decided at some point in writing that it was really necessary because the book is really about, it's using the Fast and the Furious as just a central case study that's always discussed in the context of larger changes going on in the entertainment industry. So it's like the conglomeration of entertainment companies and opening up, trying to find ways to grow into international markets and how to get into China and those guys. So those are all like big political economy type, issues. But I also felt like, I want to do the movies themselves justice. And the way to do that and to get into the way in which these movies do actually really have value to audiences is by looking at, like, what do these characters represent, right? What do they stand for? And how, and this is like one of the ways in which, I think one of the only ways in which Fast and Furious started to be written about, like in a positive way, was for the fact that compared to other major franchises in the 2000s, in that first decade, it was like noticeably diverse in its ensemble cast. So it had a much higher number of non-white characters and faces on the screen than most other franchises did. So it really stood out in that sense. And I think, like, going back to your question on the relationship between Brian and Dom and what they stand for, right? So Brian is the character who's like the character who brings you into the story. Like, whether it's a fantasy or a science fiction movie or a big action movie, it's always about the audience being brought along for a ride into an unknown world. So they usually need, like, or Hollywood executives anyway, they always think that we need a character who's like an innocent and is going to ask all the dumb questions, like, who are these people and what are they doing and how do these things work? So that's what his main function is. He's like he's like the vanilla guy, like, you know, who's just,
Paul Walker,
he doesn't have much
just
flavor.
like me.
He's just going to bring us in there, and he's like, oh my
Right.
God, I'm so impressed by these colorful people and their wacky street races, right? And he's immediately attracted and compelled by the older and some, like, when you look at these movies now and you're like, well, Vin Diesel's like so thin, and so he's not quite as buff as he would become, but he's like, compared to Paul Walker, he's huge, right? So he's massive guy, always lit in these dark spaces, tinkering around in his garage because he has his own, you know, he's his own workshop and he's his own
Hyper
man.
masculine. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And like with his shirtless, you know, singlets on, his sleeveless singlets on and stuff like that, showing off his arms. They're both different kinds of icons of desirable masculinity, right? So, like, Paul Walker is the slightly softer one, but he's just as good a driver, right? So they're always competing. So the idea that masculinity is always about competition is like front and center. And it's just something it's not something that needs any explanation. It's just something that I think works for a kind of populist Hollywood vein about working class men, because that's what it's about, right? It's two blue collar guys. And I think the central thing, the reason why I write about Dom, especially as like a working class hero, is because um, seeing him as something to aspire to, which is what the film does, right? It's like Brian wants to join Dom. He wants to be like him, and he's inviting us to be like that. Is because he's a guy who, like everybody else, like most people anyway, has to work for a living, but he doesn't experience the kind of alienation and exploitation that most people who perform wage labor, who have regular jobs, do, right? He's his own boss. He has his own workspace, and the thing that he does is he builds these amazing cars that give him tremendous agency, right? So he has speed, he has technology, he has know-how, and he can do all of this without the alienation that is, you know, fundamental to capitalism, in the sense that he has to sell his labor on an open market. And so he becomes this thing that any guy with a job, right, can relate to as something, oh God, I wish I had my own, like, workshop at home so I could spend all my time just hanging out with my friends, tinkering with my cars, sipping Coronas, you know, and going for exciting street races and boosting CD players, doing this kind of harmless petty crime that is like, you know, there's no real victim, you know, that kind of thing. And meanwhile, you know, just living the life. And so I think, like, if the way that I, as a cultural theorist, you know, as an academic, I look at pop culture, is it takes a world that we live in and that is really contradictory, right? There's a lot of stuff in there that we learn that doesn't really work the way we think it should. So we're like, go out and make something of yourself, like, work hard and you'll be successful. But most of us find, like, yeah, I work really hard, but it's like the American dream is not the thing that I thought it was going to be. It seems to be a little bit exploitative. It seems to be like the deck is stacked and stuff like that. And so movies like this, pop culture like this, really works as a form of reassurance. It's like, you too can be like Dom, even if it's just by like relaxing to these movies, to these fantasies that allow us to sort of imbibe that spirit without really thinking about it. And I think that's central, right? It's not like, let's break this down and give it to the audience and explain how these things work. But it's just like, you know, it's like a commercial. It's like, life is fine. Men like Dom exist, you know, even if they're just imaginary, right? We can relate to them, and that allows us to sort of to tune in and to get a kind of, I think, really profound enjoyment out of these things that is like, I guess I'm ruining it by putting it into words, right? But I think it does work that way, in the same way that I, like, as a kid, would just dream of being Elliot or Marty McFly or something, right? We live through these kinds of figures that represent things that we wish we could be. And when you think about them, you're like, no, I'm never going to travel in time and I'm never going to meet an alien and do this exciting stuff. But the fundamental fantasy is deeply appealing. And so I think Dom as this like working class hero, right, as the kind of thing that working people wish they could be, could have in their life, the kind of pleasure they could have in their life. That's, I think, the fundamental fantasy that he represents.
There's this interesting thing here that, because ultimately Dom becomes the face of the franchise. Although I
Yeah.
really still feel like in the first film, it's actually Brian who's the star of the film. It's
Yeah.
Brian's
Yeah.
the one going on the hero's journey, right? And
Yeah.
eventually these tones shift. And I guess, there's always that adage that everyone is the star of their own, of their own movie. Like, and that's why, I would love to, I do like on occasion stepping outside and seeing some of these other, spinoffs where we get to see the life, see the Fast and Furious through somebody else's, through
Yeah.
Shaw's eyes or whomever.
Yeah.
But we talk about these two men, and now I do want to shift and talk a little bit about Letty and Mia, because Dan, this series is famously awful at depicting women.
Yeah.
So you talk
Yeah.
about how I don't think we passed the Bechdel test until episode 9 of this series.
It's very late. Yeah. Just barely.
It's a minute, right? Can we talk
Yeah.
about where women initially fit into this franchise
Yeah.
and where the franchise starts to maybe address some of that by bringing on other characters? Charlize Theron comes on later on. Like,
Yeah.
what's up with women and how do they change throughout this franchise series?
Yeah, that's a great, like, well, like the for the first movie, they the way it was written, and again, it's important to remember who is making, like, who's deciding on what stories are being made in Hollywood, and who are the people writing these stories and in charge of them. And the answer is really, really easy. It's white guys, right? So it's a script written by a white guy based on an article about a multicultural environment, and and he's trying to make a Hollywood movie out of it. And then he gets Neil Moritz, who's a white producer, and he gets Rob Cohen, who's a white director, involved. And they just put together something that they think will be appealing to the audience they think they're making this for. And the audience they think they're making this for, it's not a 4-quadrant movie, right? It's not like for men and women and children, right? And old and young, etc. It's not that. It's like this is a movie for young men, is the way they imagine it. And so the way the women are written, when you read the script, is atrocious. It's like they're barely there. They only exist to offer like support, emotional support, and to be sexually available whenever the plot requires it. They're the reward, that you get at the end of the video game, basically. And it was only really that the actors playing these roles were sort of, were actually kind of upset by how demeaning these roles were, that they pushed back a little bit. And Letty's character, anyway, became less objectified and had more of like a sort of presence in the film, even though it's really only expressed through telling off other women to not come near her boyfriend, right? That's sort of that she's that and she, so Letty and Mia are, for a 2001 Hollywood movie, they're sort of like, well, I'm not going to say like feminist approved power women, because they're definitely not, but they're feisty, and the term that I use is drawn from another book, is like action babes, right? So they're able to hold their own. They're like the Lara Croft movie. Right. Yes, exactly. Lara Croft came out about the same time. So they're fully objectified women who are even sexier to men, at least I think that's what the writers and producers think, by not being merely decorative, right? So they also have they each have a scene in which they drive the car, and there's a scene where Paul Walker's character Brian is a little surprised that Mia is such a good driver or something, or that she can get behind the wheel. So for 2001, it's crazy to say this, because there have been many decades of women trying to make strong female characters, but compared to now, like the discussion has definitely changed about this, and we've had movies like, I don't know, Atomic Blonde and The Hunger Games and things like that. So people producing these films are more comfortable having women who behave like action heroes. In more elaborate and more diverse ways than these movies do. And so over the course, like initially, and again, this is kind of funny to imagine, but initially these movies were celebrated for the fact that they had women in them, and that these women were not just the decorative women in the tiny, tiny shorts who were always prominently present in the trailers and around the car races. Over the course of the franchise, Michelle Rodriguez and the other actors who are regulars on the franchise have increasingly expressed their frustration about the fact that the way the series developed, it really remained until Paul Walker's death, the story of Brian and Dom, and everybody else was like a supporting character. And then once Paul Walker died, it just became the Vin Diesel show, and the women were sort of even more marginalized. And so they pushed back on this, and the producers and the definitely writer-director Justin Lin were very responsive to some of these criticisms. And so by the ninth movie, the first that was the post-COVID film, or it came out right after COVID, they made sure that, like, in the opening scene, Letty and Dom are sort of equal partners in the opening, like in the cold open action sequence. And but it's never really, like, I think it's funny to see how the franchise started off as being kind of groundbreaking in the way it represented both femininity and diversity within a big Hollywood action series. But then it got I think it got passed by, right? I think the culture sort of caught up with it. And by the time Fast X came out, it's like, yeah, guys, you're still doing like your version of that thing that was a little bit progressive 2 decades ago, but that's not the thing anymore, right? You're
Right.
still, in that sense, I think it's also become a little bit of a relic.
Okay, I want to talk about 2 of the films here that I feel like we don't talk enough about. Too Fast, Too Furious in terms of this franchise a lot of times, and I feel like Tokyo Drift has its love. I'm not a fan of that film at all. But can we talk about where this franchise goes? Okay, so Dom and Brian part ways at the end of the first film.
Yeah.
The first film, by the way, is a total comfort film for me. I can watch The Fast and the Furious at any time. Like, I'm feeling sick on the couch, I'm watching it.
I love to hear this.
I love that film. And then we go 2 different ways. Too Fast, Too Furious is important to me because I'm living in West Palm Beach. That film is set in Miami. That is like home.
Oh, wow.
That is home to me. Like, I reckon with that. The music, all this stuff. I know where these places are. They go down into the Keys, and I know exactly where these spaces are.
Sure, yeah.
Not as successful. And in fact, Dom leaves after the first film, and then they can't, like, what happens after 2? Because you don't have Paul Walker back for the third film, because it feels like, okay, well, we're going to follow Paul. No. Oh, we're going to Japan.
Yeah.
What's going on? Because it feels like it takes a little while for Fast and Furious franchise to find its way. With 2 and 3.
That's a great question, and I think the answer is that is mostly that the way in which movie franchising was conceived at that time was really not the way we understand it right now, right? Right now, like, you go see a movie, and I think often, you can uncharitably say that the movie itself doesn't actually end. It just sort of sets up the next one, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go see a Marvel movie or something, and it's like, you can watch any of the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, and the whole thing is really just kind of like carefully setting up something that will hopefully, like, there's characters being introduced that don't have anything to do, but they're like, no, but they're going to be huge, like in the next Avengers team up or something like that. And so we're used to that. We're thinking like, okay, maybe this was not a great episode, but the next one's probably going to be bigger, something like that.
We'll get there, right?
But in the early 2000s, that was not that way of thinking didn't really exist. That's a television way of thinking, right? For a movie, it was like, okay, we'll make a movie, and then if it's like more successful than we expected, like the Fast and the Furious was, now let's think, like, what were the things that made this movie so successful, and how do we replicate them? Right. So you get, I think a great example is like Die Hard. Yeah. Like at the peak of early blockbuster movies in the second half of the 1980s, like this is like, you get just a mid-budget action movie that just, in which everything sort of comes together brilliantly, a little bit like, like Casablanca or something, It wasn't really designed to be a masterpiece, but it just, everything works so perfectly. And Nobody knows why it's successful, right? Is it because of Bruce Willis? Is it because of John McTiernan's direction? Is it because of, the Alan Rickman as one of the greatest villains of all time? Is it because of the action, and the fact that it's constrained within one night inside of a skyscraper? So what you get is you get like a whole new subgenre of like Die Hard on a plane, Die Hard on a boat, you get actual Die Hard sequels, some of which follow the original template, like it's in an airplane, but some are just like, okay, we'll team him up with Samuel Jackson and have them run around New York. So it's like anyone's guess what makes this thing. It's just taking a number of different things from it and putting them together in different variations and seeing what plays. And so when the Fast and the Furious comes out, it's not like, okay, it was successful, so now we'll continue this story, because there really is no story. It's just like this, like a comfort movie. It's like a formula.
Standalone
right?
Films, right? Yeah,
it's a standalone film. So they're like, okay, so how do we replay this? And nobody's thinking people went to see this because of Paul Walker or Vin Diesel, right? Because neither of them were stars, and neither of them were so like impressive or great in the movie, like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, that they were like, oh, we got to get this guy back. They offered the script to both of them. And Paul Walker was like, yeah, I'll do it. And Vin Diesel was like, oh, I won't. So they just got some other guy. And then they were just, okay, well, we'll do the same thing, but in a different city and with a different director who's going to add their own different touches to it. Right. And then for the third movie, it's like, okay, Paul Walker's asking for too much money now. And Vin Diesel was already out. And also Universal had like changed management, and they were like, what we think would work, we want to see more high school movies, because we think we're not doing enough like high school movies, and there's a market for it. So can we do another sequel that's about teenagers and about a high school dynamic? And so a screenwriter goes to work and works with a director and comes up with, and we'll also, because we're seeing that these movies are playing really well outside of the US, it would be great if we could also like do it in one of the countries where these movies play really well, like Japan, right? So, that's great. We'll do a movie about illegal street racing, but it's going to be in Japan, and it's going to be a high school movie. And then we'll just replay the formula. We'll have an older, wiser, more seasoned guy, and that's Han in the new character in the new movie. And we'll have like a new kid who's doing the Paul Walker role, and everybody will understand he's the Luke Skywalker, he's the young inexperienced one, and he has an older mentor. But then we'll do like the whole Obi-Wan thing, and Han will sacrifice himself, and then he'll have to win in the final battle, etc., etc. So that's the way. That's the way like sequels were, or even like subgenres were envisioned at that time, not in terms of continuing on an existing story, but just like, how can we make more money using this formula, and picking and choosing elements that are always a combination of what do we think worked about the previous one, what can we do financially in terms of how much are these people like asking at this point, right? And what is a trend that we think is coming, right? And then so if the trend is like high school movies have been doing really well these past 2 years, there's some executive is going to say, I want the new Fast and Furious to be a high school movie, right? So so I think that's a very elaborate answer to what's basically a very simple question, but it's like that's also what fascinated me so much about this franchise, is if you do watch them back to back, you're just the first three, but these are like three completely different movies that each tell a version of the same story, but in different cities and with mostly different characters and with different directorials, like with different styles. I mean, one thing that I really love about Too Fast, Too Furious is that it's a black director who's only made up to that point movies that are really committed to radical black filmmaking. As the director of Boys in the Hood, John Singleton, and his movies haven't been doing great financially. So now he's in a position where he's like, I gotta make something, that's going to put me back on the board, to do like a sequel or something. And the way he says in the audio commentary at one point, he says, well, I did try to put my stank on this thing, right? But there's only so much you can do. And for him, that meant like, I want to make it much more for him. Like he was into anime and cartoons. let's go crazy, let's do more extreme close-ups and like
Stuff with
cartoon and
Suki in
video
the
games.
car, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I really love. It's so colorful, and he's taking every opportunity to show off, his new charismatic black leading man, Roman. He's like, look at this guy, isn't he amazing? And even though in the script, even though he doesn't have many good lines and he doesn't have much to do besides like be Brian's co-pilot in that movie, it is kind of, he's the one who really shines. And that's, I think, besides the fact that it's like this crazy mercenary sequel with this idiotic, I love the title, Too Fast, Too Furious. It's so crazy. But it's also a movie that is full of energy and full of color and is much more, feels to me, very vibrant and full of like a different kind of style and passion than a lot of other movies in the franchise have. It's much more kind of distinctive, and so I think it's also a good example of how a filmmaker, is even if it's not an auteur or somebody like Spielberg or Christopher Nolan, who's like an established figure, can come into a job for hire and still do like little things that really matter in the way the world is represented for them, right? Especially a black director like John Singleton.
I wonder, Dan, do we get a series unless Vin Diesel does the cameo at the end of Tokyo Drift?
I think the short answer is no. I think honestly, like they finished the third movie, which for listeners who haven't seen any of these movies, the third movie, Tokyo Drift, which has become like it's always been at the bottom of the list for a lot of fans, but over the years it's become more of a fan favorite,
There's
especially
really
because of the Han character. And because it's like its own little thing. It doesn't outstay its welcome. I think it's like 91 minutes or something. It's like um, but but they previewed it, and they felt like the producer and the executives at Universal were like, yeah, okay, good job, it works, but it would be really nice if we had one little extra, like a little extra at the end to really like send people home with a smile on their face. And looking at the numbers for the DVD sales of the previous two movies, they were like, what if we brought, could we, if we ended it as if this isn't there were no plans at that point for, like, they'd have to wait and see how the movie did, whether there was going to be a sequel or not. But they did get Vin Diesel to come back, and as a pickup, like a reshoot, they had him come back, and like he's like the old friend who shows up, to race, and then we cut to black right after he like says, let's go, into the camera, and that's it. And but Justin Lin, who directed he came on board to direct the third film. Just like a young, he was in film school when he saw the Fast and the Furious and loved it. To him, that was like seeing like us seeing Star Wars back in the early 1980s. It blew his mind. He was like, I'd love to make a movie like this. And so he gets the job after his first film. He gets to do this movie. And he finds a way to get together with Vin Diesel, and they share their love of tabletop role-playing games and nerdy stuff. And he convinces Diesel to be like, well, your other franchises aren't really panning out, but I think we could make, if you wanted to do something like a Riddick saga, or a Triple X action hero saga, I think Fast and Furious is a place to do it. We just have to pick and choose components from different movies and then move it forward from there. And that's really where the franchise as we know it happens. That's where it comes together, because that's where Vin Diesel negotiates with the studio. He's like, I'll come in to do like for a day, right, to shoot that one little moment at the end, but I'll only do it if I get to be a co-producer on the next couple of movies, and I get to be a producer on the Riddick franchise, which is like his passion thing, and which he's still working on. So that's how he negotiated like a spot for himself. And then when the fourth movie, which we discussed before, but when that becomes like the getting the gang or the band back together thing, and that hits through the roof. I mean, that was more successful than any of the movies up to that point. Because they was sold Universal on that idea. They were like, look, we're seeing an audience change. The audience is changing both in the fact that international income from overseas is by now like a bigger thing than domestic, right? And so it's a growth sector. So they're like, the Fast and Furious movies can help Universal grow internationally, which we can't in North America anymore. So that was one argument. And the other thing was, we can make this into like an ongoing story, like with an ensemble of characters that we're going to keep together. And because of DVD and because of the fact that people can access these characters at home and watch the previous installments, we can keep telling, it's not much of a story, but it is a story. And we're going to keep developing those relationships and having characters, die and come back from the dead, or, set up their impending death, etc. We can play with all of those soap opera tropes like cliffhangers and stuff and build them into a big blockbuster franchise. And that's exactly what happened.
Dan, what's more important, Fast and Furious or Fast Five to the franchise?
That is a really, really hard question, because I don't think Fast and Furious is a good movie. I think it's honestly,
it's a repeat of the first film.
But much worse. It's like it's like the first movie, but without the fun, because. Okay. And I think especially because the opening scene is so phenomenal. We have the opening heist of this, with when they're in the Dominican Republic, and it's a heist of these trucks that they're stealing. It's like an opening scene out of a James Bond movie. It's setting the stakes really, really high. Cool. It's really cool. And then like within 10 minutes, they kill off one of the major characters off screen. Mm-hmm. And so Letty is gone. They just made up this whole thing about, and we're bringing everybody back together. Then they kill off Letty, and the whole thing becomes like Dom is trying to get revenge, and they got to find a way to get Brian and Dom back together. So now Brian is weirdly this FBI agent.
Brian's got a secret again, right?
He's like walking around in a suit and stuff, and he's like a Secret Service agent, like with the little ears thing, etc. But it's just to get him back into this same dynamic of the first movie, to repeat that until we get to the ending where finally they're both on the run again, and now they're actually a team. So that whole movie is part of the metaphor, but it's just like spinning its wheels to put everything in a place where you can actually start making movies that are, they're like the movies that follow, they're like a lowbrow hybrid of Ocean's 11 and Mission Impossible, right? It's like, but so with cars, right? So it's like, we'll do like a team that's going to do a heist, and all of the returning characters, and of course this ensemble just grows over the years. They each have like their own little thing that they do, and we're going to break them up into units, and some of them are going to be joking around, and others are going to be doing their technical stuff, etc. So we have a lot of dynamics going on, and we'll build this around these massive set pieces in exotic locations that are like James Bond by way of Mission Impossible, but more outrageous and less like more there's a kind of shameless self-consciousness about it. It's like, we know we're idiots, and we know this is crazy, and like Roman's main job is constantly pointing out how insane and idiotic everything is, and so that works. It relieves the pressure, and you're like, wow, this is like, it's like a no-brand Tom Cruise movie, off-brand Tom Cruise movie, right? So that's what it. So, but I think that's where the fourth movie is more important, because if that hadn't hit, the whole thing would have ended right there. And it was a hit, and the fact that it was a hit was read by the studio as being an indication that there was an audience for that thing, for the thing that they wanted to do, even though they weren't doing it yet. And then when Fast Five went even bigger, and Fast Five perfected the model that all of the other movies then continued to aspire to, and were successful, to various degrees. But that became like, it's exotic. We're setting it like, in Rio. We've got the whole team and everybody's doing their thing. We got a couple of new, characters that are going to enliven things. They're high profile, like the people that they choose. Like for Fast Five, it's Dwayne Johnson, right? His big star making role. Bring in The Rock, and according, like, that role was written for Tommy Lee Jones. And it was supposed to be Tommy Lee Jones is. Can
you imagine if this movie's part of the Fugitive universe? Instead,
I could see that crossover right there, but it would be a whole other thing. And I think, and that's where Vin Diesel was very emphatically repeating the point over and over again. He's like, I know what our fans like. Our fans want WWE stars like The Rock to be part of our franchise, and that's why I'm bringing in him instead of a real actor like Tommy Lee Jones, right? And so it's also like, and I think, and it's, of course, it's perfect for this franchise to have these two like, shaven headed, big buff
Well
guys
oiled,
out
right?
competing each other and quipping and punching things and punching each other. And it gets crazier, of course, because all of these guys, after the fifth movie, they have clauses in their contracts that won't allow them to lose a fight, right? So they can never defeat each other, because Jason Statham and Dwayne Johnson and Vin Diesel and Ryan Walker, they're all like, I can fight, but I can't lose, right? So every fight has to be like interrupted by some weird thing, because they can never lose a fist fight.
But doesn't that, like, to bring in another film here, doesn't Once Upon a Time in Hollywood really spell out why that's so important to actors? Because once it's seen that Dwayne
Yeah,
Johnson can lose a fight or Statham can lose, it becomes in their head, wait a second, now they're
yeah,
going to start making this, because Statham has to evolve into a good guy again, because he
yeah,
can't become a bad guy
yeah.
in
That's
the
a great
audience's
point. Yeah,
mind.
he can show up as like, and that's, I think that, of course, that's what happens at the end of is that oh wait, I'm getting my numbers mixed up at the end of
Does it
six, right?
matter?
Anyway, he shows up as like the guy who actually killed Han in the
Right.
third movie. And so, but of course, that plot point is already cool, but the big thing is, oh my god, we're getting actually Jason fucking Statham,
Now he's here.
into the
Right,
Fast
totally.
and Furious franchise as the ultimate villain. He's going to be the ultimate villain. But, he's too big of a star to stay a villain, right? He can't be, so he has to, the value that he represents as a global action movie star, and the persona that is attached to that, which is not a dark persona, right? Like,
Mhm.
this is the guy who co-stars, lampooning himself in a movie like Spy. He's a funny guy, and he's a charismatic guy. We like him, so we gotta bend it and bring him back into like, well, we thought that he killed Han, but actually he didn't, and also he only did it to avenge his brother. So it's part of the whole franchise ethos of men who live by very clear moral and ethical codes. So
Mhm.
he's welcome at the family barbecue, right? So it's just one of the many strange ways in which we see this sort of fascinating intersection between, on the one hand, having um, relatively complex serialized storytelling going on over the course of this, long running saga of movies, and at the same time seeing how the choices being made in terms of what the story is able to tell are equally shaped by the business logic and the entertainment business as it's shifting around them, right? It's like, it's not just what star can we bring in, but also, if we could bring in Kurt Russell for this, not just because Kurt Russell is a nice avuncular kind of guy, but we're bringing in this whole sort of idea of, this is Hollywood royalty, but the right kind, for like, it's lowbrow, blue collar. This is the guy who starred in Soldier and Escape from New York, right? He's not
Mhm.
Cary Grant, so he's going to get this. He's going to be exactly right for the brand that we have cultivated and the audience that we are growing. And that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, like, there's a real no, I gotta tell you, I think it's a real brilliant part on Diesel's part to constantly be paying attention to the desires of the audience. Like, I of course
Yeah.
want to see Tommy Lee Jones in this, right?
Yeah,
But
sure,
bringing
sure,
in
sure.
Dwayne Johnson, like, just takes this whole franchise to another level,
Yeah.
until I think sometimes, Dan, the behind, like, oh, the parents are fighting now,
Yeah,
behind the
yeah, yeah,
scenes,
yeah.
and I think the audience becomes aware of this when Michelle
Yeah.
Rodriguez starts voicing her. We don't want to get caught up in the drama behind it. I
Yeah.
don't want to think that the Diesel and Rock don't like each other. And of course, they've said that they've made up, but I don't for a second buy that. I think the egos
Yeah.
are just too damn big
I
on
think
the on this
that's
franchise.
where, and again, I'm sorry for the car metaphor again, but I think that's where we start seeing a little bit the wheels coming off a little bit of the
Yeah,
franchise. It's right. It's where like the death of Paul Walker casts a weird kind of pall over this whole thing, because he's the one character who he remains alive in the franchise. So like they delay the seventh movie that he was going to star in. They do reshoots with body doubles and off-putting CGI and stuff like that into the movie, and they make the whole ending into a big weepy,
I
I
cried.
think
I
tasteful
cried.
farewell. Oh, for sure, every time.
I cried, Dan.
It's really, really nicely done. But then, and then it's like, okay, so what do we do now? And then, of course, the issue. I think honestly, the best thing would have been for this whole series to just end right there. It's like,
Yeah.
they say their goodbye. We get a little montage of Brian over the years. Like, look at that. He was so cute and young, and he developed into this guy. Like, the actor never really cared for these movies. He was like, his agent had to convince him every single time, like, do it, guy. You want that second house.
It's
You're gonna have
too
to do
much
this
money,
movie.
pal. Right.
He didn't give a shit. And so, but for Vin Diesel, this is now his career. And for Universal, it's one of the just very few big budget mega franchises that they now have. And they're competing with other studios in the mega franchise arena. So it's really where you can say that, like, the Fast and the Furious becomes too big to fail, right? They have to have a new movie every 1 or 2 years. They had to at this point, when it's really just a mega franchise game. So there's no option. There's no way out. And then, because Vin Diesel has negotiated his way into being like the core producer of this ongoing thing. Um, he makes it into the Vin Diesel show, and this is where the sort of the dark side of how fan culture and franchising have become enmeshed. Right? Fans aren't just the hyper consumers of this thing. They're not just there to cheer them on. Fans want to know things. Fans are concerned. Fans are
Hmm.
critical. And so when rumors start leaking out that that Wayne Johnson and Vin Diesel are not getting along, and that Diesel is being this irresponsible producer. I mean, I've never been there, and I don't know, but these are the things that people start saying at one point. That he's not really doing his job in the way that his colleagues want. He's not listening to Michelle Rodriguez, who wants more feminine representation. Blah 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 blah. The whole thing, like, the brand starts to sour a little bit, and it never really, like, it never recovers after the seventh movie is the high point for the entire franchise, and the eighth movie was like, okay, can we do this without Paul Walker? It's like, yeah, we can have a hit, but it's not the same kind of hit, and it's not the same kind of feeling. It's not as big, and it doesn't have the kind of um, the kind of combination of silly fun and lightheaded
Hmm.
adventure that the previous films sort of had managed to achieve so easily. And you can see this, like, especially when because then, of course, the Rock gets sidelined into his own spin-off. They're like, well, you know I think there's a little bit of hubris there as well. It's like we can slap Fast and Furious on anything and it'll just be massive. So they get this
Hmm.
Hobbs and Shaw spin-off movie with Statham and The Rock, and it's like, it's not a flop, but by this
Does
time
okay.
it does
Right.
okay, but it's not. It's like, the movie's weirdly. It's like, I think it's 130 minutes long. It was just way too long for the kind of lightweight, buddy movie that it's trying to be.
Hmm.
It's not really thought through very well, and I think, like, just having these two guys, sort of quipping off of each other and insulting each other while also respecting each other the whole movie, it doesn't play as well on its own the way that it does when it's just its own little subplot within a larger sort of Fast and Furious family. So it kind of, like, it doesn't flop, but it also doesn't really hit big enough because by now, right now that everything is a mega blockbuster, a movie has to hit $1 billion or it's not really a hit anymore. It's a little crazy to imagine, but these movies by now, where the first Fast and Furious movie, I think it had a production budget of maybe $60 million. It's in the book. I forget off the top of my head. It certainly was less than 100. And by the time we get to the seventh, eighth movie, like, any summer blockbuster will have a budget of above 200 million, and often, like, far above 200 million.
Oh, sure.
And so the stakes have been raised to a point where movies like the Indiana Jones reboot that they did a couple years ago, The Dial of Destiny, that movie cost, I think, something like close to $400 million to produce, let alone to market, and it made globally, something like 7 or 800 million. And it sounds weird to say a 7 or 800 million dollar movie is a failure, but that,
The
like,
perception.
it's not a big enough hit to
Right.
justify, like, continuing the franchise in that way. So by this point, even though the franchise is too big to fail and they can't slow it down, it's also no longer really batting 100, in that particular arena.
One of my frustrating parts of this, and dare I critique such haute couture as Fast and the Furious, was this refusal right? To complicate the series. The fact that like you can't have Shaw remain the bad guy. He's got to have a
Yeah,
face turn.
yeah,
That we have to have justice for Han. Now Han is back. You
yeah.
know,
But for
they're
what,
like
to what end? Yeah,
right. It doesn't.
yeah,
It's like Han dying in the third film serves the franchise well. So even when we're
yeah,
watching him
yeah,
later on, we have the sense of foreboding. We're going to lose this guy. I actually think it
yeah,
kind of works,
yeah.
right? The sense that that he comes back afterwards, and it's retconned. No, now he's working for Mister. Nobody. It's like
It's
that's a
I think choices like this are almost inevitable when you're doing this kind of really like hyper long form storytelling,
yeah,
where the on the one hand you have people who are writing and directing these movies who care about the characters, who are good storytellers, who have a good sense of what plays in a kind of blockbuster like this, and they're able to make, they tinker with the engine every time, but they're still able to make it run,
yeah,
but they're also working within an industry and a field where it's like, yeah, but we do have to keep this thing going, and like Iron Man can sacrifice himself, but Robert Downey Jr., well, like a couple years down the road, we're going to bring him back because Marvel is struggling, and we need your face, we need your name, because now it's nostalgia. And
yeah.
it's a little, I think those two things, like good storytelling where um a death is meaningful because it's a death. It's
Right.
it's like it's like imagine Shakespeare writing Romeo and Juliet and being like, oh, it was a huge hit, so now we got to bring them back for the sequel. We got to find a way. Like what can we come up with to find a way
Right.
that like one of them actually
Turns out
didn't
death is
die?
just a metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I mean, when Fast X ends with Gal Gadot, Gal fucking Gadot, sorry, but like with her coming out of the submarine, and I think the producers honestly thinking this is like a gift to the fans, and I was seeing it it was honestly, it wasn't even half full, the auditorium where I saw it on opening weekend. So I mean, Fast X didn't do great.
Right.
Uh, but there were audible groans from people like, are you kidding me? It's like, is there a single character whose death you haven't used for some kind of meaningful sense of pathos, only to then like further down the line say, hey, she's alive after all. Hey, he's alive after
How do
all.
they not know? Like, do they not go back and check on her body after when
She
during that whole
falls
airplane
into
scene?
the darkness, into the void. And I guess we
They
kind of
just
know
leave her
by
there.
now,
I guess she's gone.
if you don't
They
see a dead
don't
body,
do check the
that
vitals.
means they gotta
Were they
be around.
were they really groaning because they knew we were going to be subject to more of Gal Gadot's acting?
That's another issue. Yeah.
Maybe they know what's coming, because not only that, now Netflix has put us on a film starring not only Dwayne the Rock Johnson but also Gal Gadot in the
Oh,
same
good
film.
lord, I did see that. Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah, it's really
yeah,
bad.
yeah.
At what point in time does this franchise jump the shark?
Ah, well, I mean, it depends on whom you ask. I addressed this in one of the chapters because it is one of the most discussed questions in the fandom, right? So for a lot of fans, this is going to sound crazy, but for a lot of fans, Fast Five is the movie where it jumps the shark. But these are the original fans, right? So these are people who like, and again, I say this with, I think, appropriate irony, who like the realism of the original films, who like the fact that the franchise started with small scale action movies with car stunts, and that were about illegal street racing and boosting CD players. That's what it was. And so when you get to Fast Five and you get to like these, like two muscle cars driving around the streets of Rio, dragging against all the laws of physics and gravity, this massive safe behind them, they're like, that's insane, that's impossible, this could never happen, this would only happen in some crazy superhero movie, right? So for some
Mhm.
for some people, it's like and it's that's the moment. For a whole other part of the fans, right, Fast Five is the movie where the Fast and the Furious becomes the Fast and the Furious. It's like, that's the kind of set piece that we do. And so like there's this kind of Overton window of like, where do you then put it? Is it Dom doing his Superman dive where he rescues Letty, in Furious 6, which is my favorite moment? Is it the cars driving from one skyscraper into the next one? in Furious 7.
Is it the
Is
parachutes?
is it them
yeah.
going into space, and making jokes about how they never how crazy would you be to drive your car into space? You got Ludacris up there, with Roman, and they're quipping about this. So if for most fans, they look at these specific moments and sort of on whatever your ridiculometer is for like where it becomes too ridiculous. They would say
Mhm.
that at some point it became too crazy. I tend to think it jumped the shark like immediately after once they continued with was that Furious 8, that was the
Yeah.
Fate of the Furious, right? So the Fate of the Furious is when they're like it's again, it sounds so strange when I say it out loud, but it's like Paul Walker has died, even though his character is still alive in the franchise, but now they're going to do a dark movie because everybody needs to grieve him, and so they're going to
Even
do
though he's in Oregon or wherever.
he's like
right.
he's being a dad, taking care of his kids or whatever, and so we see him driving up sometimes at the end of some of these movies, even though we all know like he's actually dead. But so um, but that's I think where it becomes the Vin Diesel show, and it's where it's where I think what happens to them really ceases to matter in terms of drama, right? Because it doesn't really make sense. And I'm just speaking as a viewer, right? As a critic, and I'm thinking like that's the moment where it's going through the motions, but it feels like it's chasing a kind of ideal of what this kind of blockbuster should be. And it's pushing especially the idea that Dom is like this, superhuman character with whom the sun rises and sets, and everything is really about everybody's relationship to him, often literally
Mhm.
holding things together and sacrificing himself and then immediately returning and all this stuff. That's, I think, so I'd say that the eighth one is where it loses its mojo. Uh, and then it gets a little bit of the energy back in the ninth movie where Justin Lin returns as a director, but it's like it feels a little bit like Too Little Too Late, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
we'll bring in John Cena. It feels a little bit desperate. It's like, oh, we'll get another charismatic wrestler.
That's actually funny because you're actually bringing up the next title of the next film, which is called Too Little Too Late.
There you go.
With the twos.
Too little. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Dan, can I ask you some, maybe not quite lightning questions, but maybe some quicker thought
Sure.
questions here on this? And this one bugs me. We talk about Dom's family and the relationship to family.
Yeah.
Dan, what happens to Leon? We never see Johnny Strong ever again in the franchise. In fact, as far as I can tell, he's in two movies. He's in the Fast and Furious, and he's in Black Hawk Down. What happens to Leon? He bails after that. After the incident on the highway, are we ever going to see him come back? Is he the big bad?
I think I no, he's not like. Well, you know what? I was going to say no because the logic of the franchise has become if you bring in a big bad, it's got to be like
Tied.
Who are they going to cast now? Ryan Gosling or something? It's like whoever's big right now is going to come in and be like a goofy big bad character. But like I think the only way forward that they've been teasing, and we're now in this kind of strange limbo where we ended Fast X on a cliffhanger ending where it looks like three of the main characters have died, though obviously they haven't, and Dom and his kid are about to die, but obviously they're not, and so it's like, oh my god, it's like they're trying, they very clearly tried to do an ending like the Infinity War Avengers ending. Like, oh, I can't wait to see what happens next, except nobody really gave a shit anymore. And so so the only way forward now, because it's been put in not indefinitely, but repetitively, it's been pushed forward saying, no, the budget is too high. No, we can't do it. No, it didn't make enough money. And Vin Diesel is becoming like he's a number of times now he's posted angry stuff on Instagram that he then almost immediately deleted about about how Universal's fucking with him and how they're just stringing him along. And when are you finally going to get this movie made? And the most hopeful things that have come out of that have been like, well, for the next movie, it's not going to be like Fast and Furious Endgame. It's not going to be like or the last Harry Potter movie, the big climax or something. We want to bring it back to like its roots. So it's going to be like a small
again
street racing movie, and that's maybe where Leon could finally be resurrected. Let's bring back like some of the well, cheaper faces that are part of the franchise, and that. But I don't think enough people besides the two of us really care enough about these.
Justice for Leon, Dan.
Justice for Leon. We can make this happen. We can hashtag this.
In a franchise filled with such esteemed thespians, who is the worst actor in this franchise?
Gal Gadot. That's the easiest question. And it's so funny because in the first movie she's in, you're kind of giving her the benefit of the doubt because it's like she gives this completely affectless performance. It's like, she's maybe very mysterious. But then you see her in other things, and then in the next movie she's like, no, she's just so that's so easy.
Really bad. Yeah.
I don't know if many, like Paul Walker was not a great actor, but he's really good at doing this kind of role. And I think
this was him.
Ludacris, he's not an actor, but he's great, in that role.
He's playing Ludacris. He's fun.
I know, exactly. So like every other person that's been a recurring character in these movies, from the large to the small, have all been fine except for Gal Gadot, I would say. So that's easy.
Yeah, she's awful. All right, most underrated film in this series. What is your favorite here of the entire series? What do you got?
My favorite one, my personal favorite one is a 6. So yeah, in London, okay. It's got a fantastic build up with the 3 major set pieces that build from one to the next, and the greatest cliffhanger ending. Like when I saw that's the first one. It is also the first one I saw in movie theaters. Honestly, the rest I all saw on DVD at the time. I went to see that in the movie theater, and then Jason Statham comes up at the end, and you're like, oh my fucking god, they're really going to do this.
Yeah, but it was also like the first one where we actually felt like the villains were equal to the good guys.
Yes,
in 6. Deckard Charles, he's a really good bad guy.
He really is, and they've got this whole like. It's really at that point it becomes very clear that they're doing this kind of it's very transparently doing this Ocean's 11 heist movie formula, but with Mission Impossible sized set pieces. But like, how do you do that but with cars? And then I thought it was some kind of stroke of demented genius to say, well, you're up against another gang of even more proficient drivers than you. And so they're two, like, as insane as it sounds, having this international like subculture of muscle car driving teams of heist specialists, which is what this now is, and then having one of them be like basically become super spies because they're now recruited to work for Kurt Russell and to be as the Mr. Nobody, the whatever secret agent. I mean, it has so many great things from so many different movie traditions: James Bond, Mission Impossible, Star Wars. It has everything in the mix there. I love that movie. That's my most, like, my biggest comfort movie. I don't know if it's like objectively the best one for sure, but the other choice I would make is always Too Fast, Too Furious, because it's so unassuming. I love what John Singleton does with design, with montage, with color. It's the most sort of, I think, especially if I look at my students now who all grew up on anime, it's the closest one to that kind of spirit. It's a little bit out there. It's a shame that they have a terrible villain and like a who gives a shit type plot, because
how dare you talk negatively about Cole Hauser
in
this age of Yellowstone.
It took me like I don't know how many watches to be like, because I kept being like, what is I have one like important point of reference for this guy and I can't come up with it. It's fucking Dazed and Confused. I'm like, of course, the whole time, right there. One of my favorite all-time favorite movies, Dazed and Confused. I watch it religiously, and so many actors in that movie, they're just so young there that I never sort of connected them, because Cole Hauser has done so many roles but he's much leaner, anyway, he doesn't look at all like the Cole Hauser of Dazed and Confused, but that's him right there.
I want to ask you this. I need to second my agreement here on Too Fast, Too Furious. And I think, like I said earlier, for me, it's the original. The original is just comfort food. I want to go back to that age of my early 20s when I'm driving around my own version of that. But yeah. You talk about this in the book because the money continues to push. And even after this franchise series is over and we're done being family on this show, we've eaten our last piece of chicken by the grill.
Yeah.
Universal's going to keep pushing for more of these. They make
Yeah.
too much money, even
Yeah.
if they take time. But Fast and Furious doesn't really have the built-in franchise fan base that necessarily that defines, say, Star Wars or Star Trek or even say Lord of the Rings. So what happens? Is there another Fast and the Furious franchise ahead of us? Like, do you think that this thing has the wheels, has the gas to make another version of this franchise? Do we start over again? Do we reboot this, or does it just we start with a new street racing crew later on? What happens next, Dan?
I mean that I think that is the question about, but not just about this particular franchise. I think because that is the question about all of franchising right now, right? It's like it's but my answer is simple. My answer is not going away. It can be dormant for a little while, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, but
Needs to be.
that's what it now. That's until things change much more dramatically than I expect them to. The logic of media production right now is defined by consolidation, conglomeration, and the ongoing, unrelenting commitment to IP that has been proved valuable over the years and that people will recognize and know. So the only movies that are being made by Hollywood studios, with vanishingly few exceptions, right? You can say, but what about Sinners? You're like, yes, well, a movie like Sinners, that's the exception that proves the rule. There you have a director who's a creative genius, who did a couple of franchise movies, right? And who managed to negotiate that into this kind of like Scorsese type deal, like one for them, one for me. It's like, yes, I will do your Black Panther movie, but then the next thing I want to do is this other thing. And I want to make sure I do it in my own way, etc. And because Sinners was a huge hit, now he's more closer to Christopher Nolan territory, right? Where you're like, or Tarantino, where you're like a brand name auteur, and people will come see it because it's you. But they're the exception to a system that simply says, okay, what have we got, right? What have we got that we own that already exists and that has stuff that we can recycle and use? And then it's just like trying to find the right match at the right time between creative people who have an idea. This is for me, that was one of the learning points of the book. It's like we tend to think of Hollywood as being this, this machine, like it's this inhuman thing, like it's like a computer. It's like an AI that just simply crunches the numbers and then produces these things. But we also know that the way that they resonate with us and the way we continue to return to them is because they're made by people who have artistic instincts and who use them within this arena and who can make great popular art. And I don't hesitate to, again, it sounds silly to say Fast and the Furious, great popular art, but even if you're going to be critical of individual movies, you can look at sequences and moments in those films that are fantastic and that are done with passion and commitment and attention to detail and a level of craftsmanship that's insane. And so they're gonna have to find, at some point, there's going to be somebody who, in the same way that Justin Lin just had an idea. He's like, I saw this movie and I'm reading a trend in media production, and it's a trend that nerds like myself, this is Justin Lin speaking at the time, nerds like myself love serialized sagas. They love things. I grew up watching, like he would always talk about watching the Star Wars trilogy and being like, oh man, how they spun this story from one movie to the next, and she turned out to be his sister, man. That was crazy. And it's like, I'm your father. That's those kinds of revelations that are drawn from a longer history of pulp fiction, and just take them and to integrate them in a way that works in a big blockbuster system. That's what they need. They need somebody who can do that. And sometimes it's somebody like Greta Gerwig, who's like, I can do this. I can start a franchise. We're going to have dozens of Mattel films and Barbie 2, 3, 4, 5, like crossovers with G.I. Joe, all that stuff, right? But you need people with vision who can launch that thing and relaunch it. And so, like right now, Fast and Furious is running on fumes, right? It's like it's in this limbo place. I'm so happy, by the way, that for a time I was like, I maybe I should wait till they finish like the Vin Diesel cycle and they have Fast X2 or whatever it is, Too Fast 2X. But I'm glad I didn't, because that's never going to happen. But it's in this producer's limbo where the guy who feels like it's his thing won't let go of it, right? So it's kind of stuck between Universal, who already kind of set up the future of the franchise by having younger actors play, Vin Diesel and his brother and like an earlier generation. Because what studios are trying to do is they're trying to make these films less dependent on the couple of stars and directors that initially were connected to them, right? And that's why AI is so important, because they want to be able to have a movie about Dom without having to
Without
negotiate
having
to deal
Dom.
with Vin
Yeah.
Diesel, right? So that would be the ideal thing. Like, we don't have to worry about the people. We can just make these movies. And so that's what's going to happen sooner or later. That's my prediction. And my predictions never come out, but that's my prediction for what it is. Sooner or later, there's going to be a Fast and Furious 2.0 or whatever. It's the return of the Fast and the Furious. You know, new parts, classic design, whatever.
Classic parts, new. Yeah, whatever. Right, totally.
And a lot of people are going to be, they're going to be people like us, like there'll be dads are going to be taking their kids to see the new franchise film that's been directed by some up and coming brilliant person who's doing amazing new things. Maybe it's a cartoon series, maybe it's like Into the Fast and Furious verse, and it's like all the different characters animated, and you have 800 Spider-Men. Now you have like different universe Doms. Who knows? There's anything. But I think the main thing is, so that's where my book ends anyways. Like it may, even when it seems like it's over, the way the industry is organized right now, it's moving in a direction where things can never be over. I remember the moment, I think it was just after the second Disney Star Wars show came out on streaming, and I was like, is this what this is now? This used to be like a huge thing and it was an event, and now it's just like a continuous trickle of stuff. And I
There's a whole
realized
other conversation.
I'm not going to live long enough to see the last Star Wars. It's never going to happen, right? And Fast and Furious it hasn't accumulated that degree of legend, of lore and just cultural saturation. But it's been one of the biggest franchises of the 21st century, and and it has, and I think that's the most valuable thing about it. It has an appeal built into it that is very much about working class masculinity, this kind of this thing that I call in the book petromasculinity, this idea that, our cars are central to our being, and there's something about cars that gives men power and agency, and as long as we're driving cars, maybe it's an all electric Fast and Furious. I don't know, anything can happen, but that has a tremendous backlog of cultural legacy, and it's going to be with us, I think, well into the future.
Dan, we've been watching these movies now for 25 years somehow, and you've been writing about them for a while. What comes next for you? Are you taking on another franchise? Are we watching a film this summer? What's in the immediate future for you?
Well, my right after I finished this book, and I finished it's once you finish I finished it about a year ago, and so since then it's gone through copy editing and revisions,
all the things.
So it's really nice to talk about it now because it's had some time to settle for me. But in that time, sure. I wrote another book, which is a book on, I wanted to do something very different. It's a book on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the movie. I ran into a buddy of mine at a conference a year and a half ago, and he said, I just wrote a book for a new series, and the series is called Film Minutes. And the format of the series is you take a movie you love and you write about it 1 minute at a time. So you break it into 60-second chunks, and then you write about it. And I said, so, but what do you have to write about? Are you just describing it? It's like, no, every minute can be whatever you want it to be. It can be, you can segue out, you can take it as a leaping off board and talk about something that connects to it in different ways. And I thought, wow, what a fantastic way to liberate, to write a book in a different way. I've written a bunch of books now, and so you're always looking for something that will, get you out of your routine in some way. So that'll be out in 10 months, I think early 27. And it was a challenge, but it was really fun to do. And now I'm in the middle of, I've been prepping a book on another franchise, but it's a very different kind of franchise. That's a book on Twin Peaks. And so like Fast and Furious was like a thing that I do like, but and that I am a fan of, but it's not, it's not like I try to go back and forth between things that I'm like deeply and fully committed to, that I just write about because I love them so much, and things that you have a little bit of critical distance from. So like Fast and Furious, I can write about critically because it's not, it's not that close to my heart.
Sure.
It's not the thing that I grew up with or something. And Twin Peaks is like as close to my heart as a thing can get. And so that's going to be the next book, is going to be a book on and specifically, sorry to like I'm in the middle of like getting this ready. Just started writing the introduction, but it's specifically on what makes Twin Peaks scary. So it's Twin Peaks is a lot of things and has been a lot of things, and how my idea is that the fundamental thing is that Twin Peaks is a horror franchise, and that's the aspect that I want to look at in the book.
Oh, buddy, whole time you've been talking, we've been talking now for about an hour and a half.
Oh, wow.
Whole time we've been talking, I've been scribbling down movies that I want you to come back on and talk about, because I've got now Texas Chainsaw Massacre on. Now I've got Twin Peaks. Kyle MacLachlan's got his autobiography coming up soon.
That's right.
I wrote down Lost Boys. I got Supergirl here in front of me. Ideas. Like, I'm just like, I've got lists, sir. So whenever you want to come back, this was a blast. Dude. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun to talk to you about this stuff, and to talk to somebody who's also like, I've talked like generally I've been on a couple of podcasts, a couple of radio shows and stuff, and mostly it's people who are like, really, you really wrote a book about those movies? And I get a little defensive. I'm like, well, they're not that bad, they're actually when you start looking at them, they're actually very interesting. But it's sort of like they're interesting because they're an illustration of something else, and it's so fun to talk about these things that I really do enjoy. I mean, I needed a break from them for a little while, because listening to all the you just immerse yourself in this thing, and at a certain point you're just like, oh god, not again. Fucking give us a break, Dom. But I'm like, now I feel like I'm ready to re-immerse myself a little bit, and this conversation with somebody who's also a fan and who's also genuinely excited and appreciative of the films has been a breath of fresh air. So thank you for that. That's been really, really wonderful.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so much to our guest, Dan Hassler-Forrest, for jumping in across the pond. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you, of course, to all of you for continuing to support the show, sharing it with your friends, and being the fans that you are. This show would not run without you. We have so much more stuff coming your way soon, so make sure you stick around. Subscribe if you like it. Ciao for now. Bye.